Hello and welcome to the second of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition's NDC Watch, where we try and look at how countries submitting new climate change commitments are including short-lived climate pollutants. By the small print of the Paris Agreement, this should have been the last of these NDC watches, with the deadline for the submission of updated nationally determined contributions coming in February. In reality, we have 11 new submissions since the January episode, with many more to come. We know that many countries, including supported by the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, are hard at work updating their NDCs, but we have 11 new NDCs to look through to explore how they are including short-lived climate pollutants in February. So we've got multiple different ways that we can look at how short-lived climate pollutants are included in NDCs. And an interesting aspect is that there is nothing in the Paris Agreement that states that short-lived climate pollutants, that non-CO2 greenhouse gases or super pollutants should be included within nationally determined contributions. There's no format for that like there are for greenhouse gases, and so you get a whole range of different ways in which short-lived climate pollutants are included. And we're going to go through a few of those ways in which SLCPs have been included within the nationally determined contributions submitted in February. So let's start. The first is targets. NDCs are all about targets. How much are countries pledging to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? And we see multiple new targets specifically targeting short-lived climate pollutants in the NDCs submitted since the last episode. New Zealand have committed to an overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, all greenhouse gases, between 51 and 55% below 2005 levels by 2035. That target has been committed to with a long-term target of achieving net zero carbon dioxide emissions and reducing biogenic methane emissions by 24 to 47% by 2050. So the target that they have, the long-term target to reduce methane emissions, which account for half of their total greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand, has informed the targets that has been set for 2035. In Canada, we see an SLCP specific target, both at the national level and at the sectoral level within Canada's updated nationally determined contribution. Canada commits in its NDC to reduce methane emissions by 35% by 2030 across all sectors, and specifically to reduce fugitive methane emissions from oil and gas production by 75% on the same timescale. And so we've seen really specific targeting of methane reductions going beyond the global goal in the Global Methane Pledge. The second way in which we see short-lived climate pollutant reduction opportunities reflected in NDCs, and we touched on this in the January episode, is that more and more NDCs are coming out not just with an overall greenhouse gas reduction target, but setting sectoral pathways by which that overall target will be achieved. I think this is a really positive development because it allows us to really understand which sectors are going to be targeted and where the heavy lifting is going to be to achieve that greenhouse gas reduction target. And it gives us a clue as to which sectors that have significant emissions of methane, of HFCs, will be contributing to achieving that target. For example, in Zimbabwe, they have a 40% emission reduction target for 2030, but also set sectoral pathways, achieving a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in energy, 10% in IPPU, which is achieved through their implementation of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, 7% reduction in agriculture, and 35% reduction in waste, which will be achieved by diverting 20% of their organic waste towards composting and 42% of the overall municipal solid waste going to waste to energy to contribute to producing electricity. So we've got a much clearer understanding of how that 40% target will be achieved. Similarly, in Lesotho, they committed to sectoral targets of reducing energy sector greenhouse gas emissions by 29%. This is both conditional and unconditional. a 50% reduction in IPPU emissions, again targeting hydrofluorocarbons, 12% in FOLU, and 30% in waste. Again, methane heavy sectors with emission reduction targets. The next category where we see NDCs that are making real commitments to reduce short-lived climate pollutants is in how co-benefits or how multiple benefits are being framed within those NDCs. And there's some really interesting information coming out of the NDCs on co-benefits. Sticking with Lesotho, to achieve that 29% reduction in energy sector emissions, commits to supporting communities to switch away from using biomass fuels for cooking. We know that there are billions of people globally who still rely on solid biomass, wood and charcoal for cooking, and doing so results in millions of premature deaths every year from household air pollution. Lesotho notes that by supporting communities to switch to more efficient biomass stoves, to switching to cooking using LPG. They even mention solar cookers and biogas as alternatives. It will not only contribute to their greenhouse gas reduction targets, but it will reduce the exposure of families and of communities to household air pollution and the negative health impacts that results in. Canada's NDC is really interesting on co-benefits. They highlight that implementing their NDC could help to improve air quality and have positive benefits for human health. They also note that the Royal Bank of Canada estimated that implementing their NDC would lead to the increase of 235 to 400,000 jobs. And they ran focus groups when the NDC was being developed to ask participants in those groups, what are the major co-benefits that you think should be prioritized in establishing their climate change target? 79% of participants, 4 in 5 participants, identified air quality and health benefits as being one of the top priorities that they should prioritize in developing the NDC. This is hugely significant and important because it not only demonstrates to the communities that work in air pollution and in climate change that these linkages are important, it shows that within the public there's an appetite to ensure that climate change mitigation improves health and improves air quality. We also see in many of the other NDCs that have been submitted a commitment to actions that we know will reduce short-lived climate pollutants, even if that reduction isn't explicitly stated within the document itself. And we get some really nice examples of how those actions can be implemented. Andorra, for example, commits to a 63% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2035 and outlines some of the actions to achieve it. Renewable electricity, energy efficiency, but importantly, is supporting people to switch to using public transport rather than private vehicles. And to achieve this, they note in their NDC that all public transport in Andorra is free of charge, demonstrating how incentives can be put in place to encourage people to shift how they get from place to place. We see in St. Lucia, for example, that they want to achieve a lot of their NDC by reducing ozone-depleting substances, including HFCs. In Ecuador, methane capture from landfills is a key measure that they want to implement to achieve their NDC. In addition to separating waste and reducing emissions from wastewater is often underrepresented in NDCs, so it's great to see Ecuador highlighting that as a priority. Singapore's NDC highlights that reducing non-CO₂ emissions are also a priority, including through the implementation of the Kigali Amendment and from able waste going to landfill through incineration of municipal solid waste and sludge from waste water. The final interesting thing that I think comes out of the 11 NDCs that have been submitted so far is that there's a lot of information about sources that are perhaps overlooked. The Marshall Islands, in committing to a 58% reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions, also highlights the contribution they're making internationally to encouraging moving international shipping over to lower emitting sources, highlighting the development of a new shipping vessel that is a combination of wind propulsion, solar and efficient engines. President Heine of the Marshall Islands notes that in the NDC that the transition in the Marshall Islands from fossil fuels to solar is not only about energy security and cleaner air, but it's also promoting jobs, including for women. We also see in New Zealand's NDC, there's a focus on biogenic methane because of its large contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And they highlight how they are working internationally to identify solutions to reducing methane emissions from enteric fermentation, and not just implementing those in New Zealand, but ensuring they can be implemented more widely. So in summary, we have 11 NDCs submitted this month that have a large contribution to make to reducing short-lived climate pollutants. And there's not one way in which each country has chosen to include short-lived climate pollutants in there. Indeed, there are countries that have been very explicit about the action they will take on short-lived climate pollutants, whereas others, you need to get into the detail of the actions they've committed to understand that those actions will not only contribute to reducing greenhouse gases, but also reducing short-lived climate pollutants. And it's up to us who are passionate and interested in working on short-lived climate pollutants to distill these documents, to identify those opportunities and help to take them forward. Thank you very much, and looking forward to next month's NDC Watch. Thank you. Bye.